Oh boy, that last one was terrible. My apologies for that. So I'm just testing to see if my glasses are rubbing on the mic here. 1 second. Well, hopefully it's good. Looks like it's good. So to make up for yesterday, what I thought I'd do is go ahead and share probably my favorite book. It's Friedrich Nietzsche's Also Sprach Zarathustra, Also Spake Zarathustra. I really like the R.J. Hollingdale translation, but like I've said before, I mean, it's not a big difference in English. The French seems to be closer to the German. But as I'm reading Paul Tillich, a German theologian, philosopher who loved Nietzsche, I think he makes my case that Nietzsche, having written in German, particularly High German, it really does take a German to understand what he was getting at, because Paul Tillich uses Nietzsche's philosophy in the way that I explain it to explain his own. So I thought, well, not to break anybody's copyright, I don't think the R.J. Hollingdale is under copyright still, because it doesn't seem to be published right now. But being a little bit, what would you call it, copyright being so weird as it is, I thought, I'm not reading the whole book here. I thought I'd read one of my favorite chapters. It's from the first section of the book, Zarathustra. It's actually the third after his prologue. Right? It goes Zarathustra's prologue, then the three metamorphoses, then the chair of virtue. The R.J. Hollingdale has an excellent introduction. Another reason why I recommend it. Also notes. What's funny is this particular chapter has quite a few notes. But it's called Of the Afterworldsmen. And it opens with, once Zarathustra too cast his deluded fancy beyond mankind, like all afterworldsmen. That's the first note. And it's Hinterwelter. Coinage meaning those who believe in an afterlife, but Hinterwelter, like those who have, Hinter is between, Welt meaning, life, or so a believer in the between life, those who believe in an afterlife. It gains force from a similarity to the word Hinterwelter, backworldsmen. And I like what Nietzsche is trying to say here, that the between worlds or the afterworlds is something that we ourselves must harvest, like a backworldsman. So it goes on and says, then the world seemed to me the work of a suffering and tormented God. Now I can't say specifically on this, but the German for this line definitely sounds like it could be read in more than one way. The next line is, then the world seemed to me the dream and fiction of a god, colored vapor before the eyes of a discontented God. This is interesting if you actually read it in the German. It can be read as I said the previous line. So is he inferring we're the God? But big deal is the dream and fiction, because the words used it's a story being told. Are we the God? Are we the storyteller? Is it a story being told? And then the colored vapor resonates throughout. And this could be an allusion to Maya, which is part of the reason why I use Om Vapor as one of my nom de plume, because it has this kind of like Om itself, this connotation of being in the world but not of the world. Right? But it goes on and says, then the world seemed to me the dream and fiction of a God, colored vapors before the eyes of a discontented God. Good and evil and joy and sorrow and I and you, I thought them colored vapor before the Creator's eyes. So here's a couple things that I'll just mention. This is why Nietzsche's Zarathustra needs a skeleton because discontented God or disenchanted God or disenchanted one, depends on how you read that. I like other translations, good and evil, joy and sorrow, and I and thou. I prefer I and thou, not I and you. I thought them colored vapor before the Creator's eyes. That actual word in German, if you were to split it up, it changes the meaning completely. It changes it from the Creator's eyes to ours. And then it goes on and it says the Creator wanted to look away from himself, so he created the world. I love this because this relates to something that Nietzsche says later, that, or maybe even in another book, pardon me, just off the cuff here as I'm waiting for a Linux installation to finish up here. And after having listened to the botched job I did on Heart of Darkness, and then this morning was kind of crap because Audible on my phone died, I guess, from streaming for the last 5 months. It seems to have just gone kaput. So I lost all my metrics, the hours I listened, what I listened to, when, and all that. But more importantly, I don't have my audiobook app. But this is the Amore Fati, the eternal return. I mean, it has allowed me to realize, well, this is holding me back. I'm listening to 6, 8, 9 hours of audiobooks a day when I should be writing 6, 8, 9 hours a day. So I'll go on and say, the Creator wanted to look away from himself, so he created the world. Right? This is something that Nietzsche talks about later, that God has his own hell, and that's his love for man. Right? So again, he wanted to look away from himself, so he created the world, but did he create for himself something even worse? And it goes on, it says, it is intoxicating joy for the sufferer to look away from his suffering and to forget himself. And that almost sounds as if it could have been taken right from Emerson, which is, the essays of Emerson is what Nietzsche used to carry around with himself while he was walking and writing a lot of these passages. As he said, nothing good ever comes if it didn't come to mind when you were walking. So it goes on, it says, intoxicating joy and self-forgetting. That is once I thought the world, right? Eternal return, the Amore Fati. So you don't want to forget yourself. You don't want to deny yourself. You want to embrace what comes as order. And the chapter goes on, it says, this world, the eternally imperfect, the eternal and imperfect image of a contradiction, in intoxicating joy to its imperfect creator. That is what I once thought the world. Again, this world, the eternally imperfect, the eternal and imperfect image of a contradiction. So we see here contradiction, duality. So this world, as he said before, colored vapor, it seemed a contradiction. Right? And what he says here, the eternally imperfect, the eternal and imperfect image of a contradiction. Right? So is it the imperfectness? Is it the duality? Is it the world itself that's the image? That is the contradiction? And he goes on and says, an intoxicating joy to its imperfect creator. Here's another reference to, like I said, are we the creator? Are we speaking of the creator? Are we speaking of the same at once? And that paragraph ends with, that is what I once thought the world. And it goes on and says, thus I too once cast my deluded fancy beyond mankind, like all afterworldsmen beyond mankind in reality. Right? So this, again, loses a little bit in the English. The deluded fancy actually relates closer to our evaluation, Schätzen, this idea of what we value, I argue, where Jung got his idea for synchronicity. You're finding it in some of these lines, but he's also telegraphing to what he's going to say below. He says, brothers, this God which I created was human work and human madness, like all gods. He was human and only a poor piece of man and ego. This phantom came to me from my own fire and ashes. Right? I love this in Sanskrit, Agni. Right? Carry your own fire and ashes up the mountain to recreate yourselves phantom. Phantom, depending on how you translate that, could be shadow. Again, an influence on our friend Jung. This paragraph goes on and says, that is the truth. It did not come to me from the beyond. Again, he was human, only a poor piece of man and ego. This phantom came to me from my own fire and ashes. That is the truth. It did not come to me from the beyond, right? So this realization of self, know thyself, doesn't come externally. It comes from an internal, what would you call it, work. But we also see the influence of the Indian philosophy on Nietzsche here. His buddy Deussen, and of course Mueller as well at the time, and even before that. But more importantly, what I want to point out here is, again, the self, this phantom, right? Man and ego, separating this construct of self from our physical somatic experience, right? Doesn't come from the beyond, right? Many may read this as a denial of the metta, but it's an endorsement of the metta being that is mankind. And this chapter goes on. It says, what happened, my brothers? I, the sufferer, overcame myself. I carried my own ashes to the mountains. I made for myself a brighter flame, and behold, the phantom fled from me. I think that speaks for itself, what we spoke about in the previous paragraph. Let's apologize. And now he goes on. Now to me, the convalescent, it would be suffering and torment to believe in such phantoms. It would be suffering to me now and humiliation. Thus I speak to the Afterworldsmen. It was suffering and impotence that created all afterworlds, and that brief madness of happiness that only the greatest sufferer experiences. Right? So here's where we see, I'm not praising the Afterworldsmen. I'm criticizing them for denying this world for another. Right? And a reference, obviously, to Job here, right? It was the suffering and impotence when you feel like you don't have your agency, when you feel like you're suffering from, you feel powerless because of your suffering. You get this idea of Job, and here again, right? It's this brief madness and the happiness that comes from the belief in a better world, if our suffering can end, as opposed to Nietzsche's belief in the amor fati, to embrace your fate. So this chapter goes on. It says, weariness, which wants to reach the ultimate with a single leap, with a death leap. And now this has a note. Obviously, it's the reference to Søren Kierkegaard, who advocated a return to Christianity by means of a leap from unbelief into belief, is perhaps being criticized here. Much in this chapter reads like a refutation of Kierkegaard. But I argue this is not just a reference to the Kierkegaard, but it's a blind leap, right? Because he goes on and says, a poor, ignorant weariness. And as before, he said it's suffering and impotence that created all afterwards, that brief madness of happiness that only the greatest sufferer experiences. So I don't think he's criticizing Kierkegaard here. He's criticizing what he will go on to more clearly talk about in the next chapter, the despisers of the body, those that will live only for the afterworld, the next life, instead of embracing your lot, right? Amor fati, the eternal return, right? So it says this death leap, a poor, ignorant weariness which no longer wants even to want, that created all gods and afterworlds, right? This idea to want better, right? As Tillich would call this courage in the face of suffering to be happy, right? As Albert Camus would say that you must imagine Sisyphus content. And I like that translation because the idea is happy is a choice, just as contentedness is. And this chapter goes on and it says, believe me, my brothers, it was the body that despaired of the body, that touched the ultimate walls with the fingers of its deluded spirit. Believe me, my brothers, it was the body that despaired of the earth, that heard the belly of being speak to it. And then it wanted to get its head through the ultimate walls, and not its head only. And I like this because this is also another note, but not completely explained in the note. So this phrase comes from mit dem Kopf durch die Wand wollen. And again, please don't criticize my German. It is terrible, I agree. Now, in the notes, it translates it as to run full tilt at everything. But again, mit dem Kopf durch die Wand wollen. So we have you pitch your head against everything, I guess, yes. Anything and everything. Kind of like the rebel. Without a cause, right? What are you rebelling against? Well, what do you got? But it's also this hard-headedness, this stubbornness, right? And even, cutting off your nose to spite your own face in the English sense that tilting at windmills, right? This idea that this stubbornness leads them to not see the truth of their own actions. But again, I'll go on here. So I'll start over that paragraph. And then it wanted to get its head through the ultimate walls, and not its head only, over into the other world, right? Stubbornness will get us to the other side. And the chapter goes on and says, but that other world, that inhuman, dehumanized world, which is heavenly nothing, is well hidden from men, and the belly of being does not speak to man except as man. It's a reference, I do believe, that we can't have divine... it's complicated. We'll forget that. The belly of being does not speak to man except as man, right? So the only way we can understand the nature of reality and our existence is through our existence, our experience, right? So we're not a finite being. I mean, we're not an infinite being in a finite experience, right? We're in the world, not of the world. It's a terrible expression for this one here. And as he says, right, but that other world, that inhuman, dehumanized world, which is heavenly nothing. So what I mean is these people that deny. This is why I see the importance of tantric practice. These people who deny our somatic experience, deny our life, and live only for the next life or another life is an incredible mistake. Because, as he says, the belly of being does not speak to man except as man. So, how can you know God except through man? Right? You can't deny your life because it is through this being, through this belly, as Nietzsche likes to talk about, that if it weren't for our bellies, we'd be gods. This is what he's talking about here, which is why almost all of it ties together, almost his entire corpus, right? And again, which is heavenly nothing. Here's his strong influence, the strong influence of the Upanishads and Buddhist thought, is well hidden from men, right? Not invisible, hidden, and the belly of being does not speak to man except as man. Truly all being is hard to demonstrate. It is hard to make it speak. Yet tell me, brothers, is not the most wonderful of all things most clearly demonstrated? I I mean, again, this reference, if you see it, if you know, you know. Tell me, brothers, is not the most wonderful of all things most clearly demonstrated? It's that expression, not all things that can be measured are of not all things that can be measured are of value, because not all things of value can be measured. Yes, he goes on, yes, this ego, with its contradiction and confusion, speaks most honestly of its being, this creating, willing, evaluating ego. Here's what I've told you, this willing, right, the Vidin Macht is as Paul Tillich says, is less about will and less about power and more about what power your will and what you find of value, your creation, how you evaluate this Schatzen and these different forms of value, of precious or treasure or creating or willing. He says, which is the measure and value of things, right? So it is almost the Bhagavad Gita. It's almost the Bible, right? Better than faith are acts. Better than all the yogs as the yoga of action, karma yoga. This idea that St. Juan of the Cross said these things aren't understood when sought, but when practiced and then found, practiced first. And so I go on and he says, and this most honest being, the ego, it speaks of the body. It insists upon the body, even when it fables and fabricates and flutters with broken wings. Ever more honestly it learns to speak, the ego. And the more it learns, the more it finds titles and honors for the body and the earth. My ego taught me a new pride. I teach it to men, no longer to bury the head in the sand of heavenly things, but to carry it freely, an earthly head which creates meaning for the earth. I teach mankind a new will, to desire this path that men have followed blindly, and to call it good, and no more to creep aside from it like the sick and the dying. There's a lot to unwrap there, but just plain and simple, as Genesis opens, it says, and all of heaven and creation was created, and God said it was good. Right? So how dare we deny life, the body, our somatic experience? And the previous paragraph where it mentions about we find titles and honors for the body and the earth, these ego, right? It's a veiled reference to the storehouse of consciousness, the Buddhist, the Upashanic, Vedic idea of the self being a configuration file of preferences, something that we just keep a list of things that we like and prefer, and that becomes what we think is the self, the ego. And the chapter goes on, it says it was the sick and dying who despised the body and the earth and invented the things of heaven and the redeeming drops of blood, but even these sweet and dismal poisons they took from the body of the earth. They wanted to escape from their misery, and the stars were too far for them. Now, then they sighed, oh, if only there were heavenly paths by which to creep into another existence and into happiness. Then they contrived for themselves their secret ways and their draughts of blood. Now they thought themselves transported from their bodies and from this earth, these ingrates. Yet to what do they owe the convulsion and joy of their transport? To their bodies and to this earth. Zarathustra is gentle with the sick. Truly, He is not angry at their manner of consolation and ingratitude. May they become convalescents and overcomers and make for themselves a higher body. Neither is Zarathustra angry with the convalescent if he glances tenderly at his illusions and creeps at midnight around the grave of his God, but even his tears still speak to me of sickness and a sick body. There have always been many sickly people among those who invent fables and long for God. They have a raging hate for the enlightened man and for that youngest of virtues, which is called honesty. They are always looking back to dark ages. Then, indeed, illusion and faith were a different question. Raving of the reason was likeness to God, and doubt was sin. I know these godlike people all too well. They want to be believed in, and doubt to be sin. I also know all too well what it is they themselves most firmly believe in. Truly, not in afterworlds and redeeming drops of blood. They believe most firmly in the body, and their own body is for them their thing in itself. But it is a sickly thing to them, and they would dearly like to get out of their skins. That is why they hearken to preachers of death, and themselves preach afterworlds. Listen rather, my brothers, to the voice of the healthy body. This is a purer voice and a more honest one. Purer and more honest of speech is the healthy body, perfect and square-built, and it speaks of the meaning of the earth. Thus spoke Zarathustra.